Every year, healthcare product teams burn millions of dollars rediscovering the same failures. Why provider directories always break, why prior auth is harder than it looks, why claims adjudication isn't as simple as just send a claim with a future date. Same mistakes, same surprises, same dead ends. Ops I Did Again is a healthcare failure archive. Each episode is a post-mortem on a product or feature that didn't work the way it was supposed to. Real forensics on what went wrong and what would need to be true for it to go right. My goal, an encyclopedia of known failures so the next generation of builders can skip the mistakes we've already made and fail at something exciting and new. I'm Alex, Chief of Staff at Out of Pocket, a healthcare media and education company. I spent about 10 years in product before moving into ops, and I've always been the person pushing for root cause analyses. This is the failure archive I wish I'd existed when I was starting out. Hey, welcome to this episode of Ops I Did It Again, Season 2, Episode 1. So, let's say your executive just asked your team to build a symptom tracker. It seems really straightforward, right? Ask patients how they feel, collect the data, put it into a graph, put it in the mobile app, bada bing, bada boom. Then in 6 months, pull the numbers. Patients came in at a 9 out of 10 on your symptom tracker, and then after 6 months of sustained weekly active use, they're at a 3. Company gets a CPT code, you get promoted to senior product manager, everyone goes home happy. Paul Wicks has spent 25 years watching that plan run into walls. In this episode, neuropsychologist and digital health consultant and PhD, Paul Wicks walks Alex through everything product teams don't know when they start building patient-reported outcomes into their apps. From why researchers should physically walk through hospitals as patients before locking trial protocols, to why your scale might use a crab instead of a number 1 through 10. Enjoy. Paul, it is wonderful to chat with you today. Can you tell me some quick highlights of your past, an intro about yourself, and what parts of healthcare you are currently in?
Sure. So I'm a neuropsychologist by training. So I'm not a medical doctor. I have a PhD in research neuropsychology, and what I studied was cognitive changes that happened in patients living with ALS. So ALS, you may know, rapidly fatal neurodegenerative disease. Very sadly, patients with that condition only have a prognosis of around 18 months. And historically, we'd thought that their brain was not affected. So a famous case like Stephen Hawking is the first thing that often comes to minds. But unfortunately, we now know that there's an overlap between ALS and some forms of dementia. So frontal lobe dementia, like Bruce Willis has, is a condition you sometimes get on top of ALS. And so very sadly, my research was around trying to establish this using brain scans like MRI and PET scans, and also cognitive tests. So as part of that work, I ended up running an online community for patients who could connect with one another from their homes. And as you can imagine, as people with ALS lose the use of their voice and their fingers and their ability to use computers, they might use assistive technology, assistive communications, and going back 25 years nearly, sending emails, putting posts on a bulletin board. If it takes you 3 hours and you're using a blink switch, that's okay, you can do that, right? So we were getting these really rich, detailed conversations between patients and caregivers on this online site at the hospital that I worked at. And then I worked as kind of an interface between those groups of people. So the researchers at the hospital designing their studies, and the patients, the potential participants who had questions like, if I've got this terminal illness and everybody dies, why do we have a placebo arm? For them, it might seem unethical that they're going to be enrolled in a study for a year or two, that, when they don't have much time, only to potentially be given an injection of saline or a sugar pill. So I think I spent a lot of my early career sort of being an interface between research and the patient community online. That's kind of been a real through line of my career.
Wow. Am I correct? The tenor of that conversation is, hey, I am a patient here. I would very much like to have the real intervention, but
Yes.
you are telling me that there is a random chance that I will not. And do I want to do this? And
Yeah.
having to mediate that conversation.
Exactly. Having to mediate that conversation, and what that grew into was me working with a company in America called PatientsLikeMe that hosted online communities for patients with thousands of members with conditions like ALS, MS, Parkinson's, lupus, fibromyalgia. And what we managed to sort of evolve to was relationships with trial designers and pharmaceutical companies where we would say, look, we can show a version of the protocol to the types of patients who would consider taking part in your trial and get them to rate which aspects are interesting to them, like maybe the drug is hoping to slow down your condition and improve your symptoms, and which things would be off-putting. So maybe it's going to have a spinal tap or a lumbar puncture, right? We're going to put a needle into your spine to infuse the drug. And to understand almost from a product testing point of view, if this was an experience, what could we do to make it better? And often we would hear that patients are clearly very willing to be altruistic. They're very willing to take part in research, but they would appreciate certain bits of information. They would appreciate accommodations to be made. Like, do I really have to get to Mass General at 9 a.m. on a Friday via public transport? Like, can't you send me an Uber? Or maybe my spouse is going to take me. What is he or she meant to do whilst I'm in the scanner for 6 hours? Like, can they have Wi-Fi? Can they have a lunch voucher? Where do I put my dog? Where do I put my children? Who's going to pay for the babysitter? So these types of questions that scientists do not think about, patients do. And of course, the scientists were frustrated if people wouldn't sign up for their trials. If you're trying to enroll in a clinical trial, so 1 in 5 clinical trials recruits 0 patients, and half of trials under recruit, which means you might not be powerful enough to really test whether or not the drug that you're examining has an effect or not. So yeah, we kind of made a sort of almost like a production line approach to taking clinical trial protocols, showing them to patients, giving the insights back to pharma, and in many cases changing the trial as a result. So one of the biggest changes we helped a trial make was to add what's called an open label extension. So yes, patients were willing to take a chance with placebo, but after say 6 months, everybody on the placebo group would also get a chance to take the active treatment. And
I see.
That can be useful scientifically for sure, right? But also it just feels more fair, more equitable. And I think trial designers of the 70s, 80s, 90s could just say, well, this is the only trial available to you. It's for research, it's not for care. Take it or not. Patients nowadays, they can go on clinicaltrials.gov. They can be targeted through Facebook ads in some cases, etc. So they had a lot more choice. So yeah, like I say, my work has been trying to ideally take the voice of patients and bring it to decision makers to make better decisions. Yeah, so I worked at PatientsLikeMe for about 13 years, continued my research contributions in ALS and motor neuron disease. And then for the past 6 years, I've been an independent consultant. So working with digital health companies from startup Series A up to larger companies like AstraZeneca and Biogen, working on strategy as regards to digital health, but in particular for their evidence base. So if you've got a psychiatrist who's seeing lots of children and adolescents with depression, and a company comes along and they say, look, we've got an app and we can help manage the mental health of these very vulnerable. You're a clinician, you want to go, well, how do I know this is going to work? And so what my work has often been about is helping to publish evidence, whether that's posters at conferences, peer-reviewed manuscripts in top medical journals, or just communicating the evidence that people have to sort of make effective claims that an intervention might be safe and might be effective, or it might be much more scalable, right? So clearly a chatbot or a digital therapeutic may not be as effective as speaking to the world's greatest psychiatrist, but when there's a 2-year waiting list for the world's greatest psychiatrist and only rich people can see them, you have to say, okay, well, what's the trade-off, right? Of it would cost very little to incrementally scale a solution to 1 million users or 10 million users or more. What are the right trade-offs? Sometimes you get into this question of, is it a utilitarian approach or is it the traditional medical approach, which is first do no harm, which often speaks to the N of one, the patient that you have in front of you, and your responsibility as a clinician. And if you're a clinician with a list of a few hundred patients or a few thousand patients, it's actually not your job to think about the 100 million people with a condition. It's your job to think about your patients in your health system and your practice. That's why it's interesting. So again, this theme of mediation, I sometimes find myself a mediator between tech innovators, sort of Silicon Valley mindset, and a more traditional clinical research mindset. And so ideally where I'm working well is I'm sort of bringing those together and bridging that gap and saying, okay, could we generate evidence quickly that's good to help make the case? And in a post-Theranos world, you have to prove that it works. But you also can't spend 2 years in peer review waiting for it to get rejected. So I help build the infrastructure that helps people say, well, okay, this small-scale pilot would be great to get out there. Let's put it as a preprint. Let's put it in a small formative journal. Let's show it at a conference. And then by the time we're ready for a big pivotal study to go out to a bigger journal like Nature Digital Medicine, our readers can read the breadcrumbs of how we got there. They can see our working. They can understand what's in the black box. And I think that's important for patients, for clinicians, for investors, for everyone in the health ecosystem.
Wow. Some of the things that I was thinking about of like, there's a user design for patients in clinical trials, right? You got to check your initial, or maybe your initial frustration of why aren't people joining this clinical trial, and then actually ask like, well, actually, why aren't people joining this clinical trial? What are the things preventing them?
Yeah.
Such as we got to think about their transportation to here, right? If they're wheelchair bound, it's going to be really hard to get them onto a bus or a train, right? And so we should probably look into sending out some like accessible vans to help them. And that would probably help us in the long run of getting to our statistical power for sample size faster.
Yeah, and I've seen a variety of approaches work there. There's another company I've worked with called InVibe who would send people sort of an interactive app, and they would show them the protocol, and then they'd record their live vocal reactions to it. So the work Patients Like Me did a lot of surveys. This one, people will read it and go, oh, I don't want to do that. You want to biopsy my salivary gland? That sounds disgusting. I don't want to do that. That doesn't sound right to me. And although it's one thing to show an executive a graph, it's a real other thing to let them hear a recording of another human being. Because when you're a scientist and you're perhaps saying, well, here's this protocol we did in mice or primates or something else to test for safety and efficacy, I'm not always sure that the scientists make that switch from animal to human, right? And at the end of the day, they're thinking of the graph. They're thinking of the graph it's going to make. So one of the most interesting experiences I saw a drug company take was once the protocol was locked in and they had their first site, a bunch of the clinical team showed up at the hospital at 9 a.m. on a Friday and walked through the process. So they showed up to the front door of the hospital, and guess what? They got lost. Because if I dropped you in the middle of UCSF and said, find room 123, or find the testing room, find the trial 123 testing room, off you go. It's a big campus, right? The reception staff don't know. There's no signage. There's no whatever. So they got lost. And then they sat there and they were in a waiting room, and they were given loads of paper questionnaires. And they were like, well, this should be an email that we send a week before and you do it at home. Let's make better use of your time. So anyway, these types of simulations, that's still pretty innovative and pretty groundbreaking. But in every other factor of life, everything you touch with your hand has gone through UX design. And if it hasn't, if it's a product, then there's probably reviews on Amazon slating it or doing
saying
I hate this, or this button's too small, or whatever. And then if that company wants to stay in business, guess what? They better make a version 2, version 3. It's not like that in healthcare. If I've got the only treatment for a rare disease or something, I'm kind of the only game in town. And then, yeah, it can be a real challenge to get people to continue to buy in when the rest of their life has been so convenient. So we need to do more work there. Things like decentralized clinical trials where you can take part in some elements of the site visits at home, or they can even send a nurse to your home. I think that's increasingly important too.
Here's a note from one of our sponsors. Imagine a rideshare app quotes you $25 to get across town. Great ride, 5 stars. Then a week later, you get a $300 charge with fees for things like dynamic demand recalibration and aux cord usage. You are 100% disputing that charge. That's surprise medical bills. The care can be excellent, but if costs blindside your patients afterward, that's all they're going to remember. Nirvana fixes the problem of surprise medical bills by answering 2 questions about a patient before they walk in the door. 1, are they covered? And 2, what will it actually cost them? Nirvana delivers real-time eligibility checks and cost estimates and plugs right into your existing workflows. If you want your front desk and billing teams spending less time chasing eligibility and more time on covered billable appointments, head to meetnirvana.com/OOP for a demo and discounted rate. That's meetnirvana.com/letters OOP. I think this is a good place to switch into the topic, which is patient-reported outcomes, and specifically a feature that often gets built by some product or an engineering team in conjunction with some other folks, symptom tracking for patients with chronic health conditions. My kind of mental model of this is my Headspace app, where every 2 weeks I get a light little nudge of how is your stress, right? And I do 10 questions, which I assume maps to something like a PHQ-9 or some scale that measures stress and anxiety. And then every month I get one for some other like category of stress. And all I know is that they are on slightly different cadences and they have slightly different questions, and I'm not exactly sure, but they're low, and Headspace tells me I'm good. And ostensibly Headspace uses that data, as you were saying, to be able to show we have had 30,000 people go through this, and within 6 months they go from this to this.
They go from very bad to very good, and it's because of us and how wonderful.
Right, yeah. There's also like an attribution layer to that, which is that they were using it every day or once a week or something like that. That's my mental model.
Sure. So let me try and take it back a little bit, just talk about how medicine has in general measured patients. So
Okay.
traditionally it's been with signs and symptoms, with some degree of objective measurement as well. So these form part of diagnosis in many cases and telling the difference between different conditions. But the diseases that we treat the best, things like high blood pressure, cholesterol, diabetes, HIV, other infectious diseases, are almost certainly the diseases we can reliably with objective biomarkers, right? So you could argue that it was the measurement of HIV that is a foundational technology to enable anti-HIV drugs. The problem is when you look around a lot of the disease burden caused by chronic conditions, they're in immeasurable diseases. There are no inches of insomnia, there are no pounds of pain. It's a problem because we can't standardize. I mentioned the Industrial Revolution earlier on. The Industrial Revolution was made in part due to the meter and the millimeter and measurement tools that show the same amount of steel to iron ratio in Birmingham as they do in Paris. We don't have that for fibromyalgia, for bipolar disorder, for pain in cancer or insomnia in multiple sclerosis. And so that's a real problem because what we can't measure, we can't reliably change. Over the last 50 years, there's been a development of these tools called patient-reported outcomes, or PROs. And if you look at them, they're basically the types of questionnaires that you're talking about filling in on your mental health app. So they often have between 10 and 40 questions. 36 is the magic number because of the S of 36 for some reason. And they might be all about your disease, or they might be about your quality of life more broadly. And your quality of life is often divided up into your physical functioning, your mental functioning, and your social functioning. So there might be a condition-specific PRO, say about your MS, which might ask about your speech, your walking, your sensory function, that type of thing. And then there might be a general quality of life measure, which might say, how much of a challenge do you have in getting to the shops, in doing your job, in doing your usual activities, in seeing your friends? And there are thousands of PROs. So there's more than 100 in MS easily. And the challenge is that everybody uses a slightly different one. So we don't have that common set of tools. And like you were saying earlier, they often vary in what they measure. So maybe one tool talks about sexual dysfunction in MS and another one doesn't. One tool talks about constipation in Parkinson's disease and another one doesn't think that's relevant. So whatever you're not measuring, you can't do much about. And then the other thing is, how long a time range do you take? So if I asked you about your mood, how are you feeling right now? I could probably ask you that 3 or 4 times a day, and I might get a different answer. If I say, how good are you at walking, or how well are you walking, the answer today is very likely to be the same as it was last week or a month ago or a year ago, right? Unless you have a disease that changes a lot. And the challenge is we've got all these diseases where things do change a lot. So if you've got multiple sclerosis and you could walk great last week, that doesn't actually tell me that much about how you might be walking this week because you may have had a relapse, right? So you can start to see how the sort of information space gets a bit clogged up. So usually where these are used in clinical trials, so like we were talking about earlier, so although the primary measure and the primary outcome that the FDA normally uses is an objective measure like a brain scan or a clinical rating by a doctor, there's often a secondary measure that looks at things like symptoms like insomnia, pain, fatigue, and your physical functioning, your ability to do things. But there are challenges like the quality of life things are very outdated. So when I said earlier, how well can you go to the grocery store? When did you last go to a grocery store?
Right. Delivery.
Or the rheumatoid arthritis questionnaire used to say, how well can you reach a high shelf? And everyone I know with rheumatoid arthritis doesn't have high shelves. There was an even worse
example. Their systems around them to
you change your life to manage it. There was a terrible example in the fibromyalgia impact questionnaire that was written in the 90s, 2000s, but looks like this sort of Stepford housewife thing. And it's like, how well can you do the vacuuming? How well cook a meal for your family?
Yeah.
It was... Yeah,
like old movies, right? It doesn't hold up to the.
It doesn't hold up
to a reread.
Present day. So there are some challenges with PROs, and then one of the things we found at Patients Like Me is many patients with the chronic health conditions have multiple comorbidities, right? So let's say now you have hypertension, COPD, insomnia, Parkinson's disease, and diabetes, which is not an impossible combination, right? So the average American above the age of about 30 has around 3 medical conditions. That's from ed data. So people usually have more than one. So should we give them a questionnaire for every condition?
Yeah.
If you're
Hitting them multiple times a week for different.
yeah, you're already fatigued, and now there's these questionnaires pinging at you. And then you mentioned attribution earlier. Yeah, if I'm feeling really wiped out, is that because of my COPD making me breathless, or is that because of my diabetes and I'm having a sugar low, or maybe it's my depression? Like, how am I meant to figure that out? So, yeah, so there are some inherent questions in there.
And probably for this patient, they've got 7 different specialists each
Yeah,
for one of those very specific things who are probably not talking to each other because we know that is a situation in the US healthcare system that systems don't
yeah,
talk.
exactly. So,
Systematically, like they do not
yeah,
talk.
if you do, so I think there's been a lot of excitement over the past few years about your electronic health records, and I don't know if you ever looked at yours. I've looked at mine, and I'm relatively healthy, so they're relatively boring. It
Yeah.
says what visits you have and maybe some blood work and what have you, but it doesn't really tie to how you were doing or how you were feeling. And I bet your Apple Health app or whatever that tracks your exercise, and maybe you can do your mood, you can do period tracking on there now, if that's relevant for you.
One thing that I always try to ask about is in the 4 Ps, right? Patients, providers, payers, and pharma. Who is all involved when it comes to patient reported outcomes? And could you give me a little brief overview of what their incentives are around this data?
Sure. So Pharma uses patient-reported outcomes in its clinical trials as exploratory endpoints. And the hope is that if your drug not only moves an objective biomarker like blood pressure, but also improves quality of life or improves symptoms, that's something you could put in a claim in your marketing materials and your advertising materials. So there aren't many drugs that have managed to hit that level, but it's always important to measure it just to understand what impact it's having. Payers, I think, don't think about patient-reported outcomes a ton because there's not as much of a link to cost. Sometimes they're encouraged to, or encouraging providers to put them into quality measures and things like that, ensure that things are being measured systematically and that there's equity of access to different interventions. But yeah, I don't think there's many people at payers staying awake at night worrying about moving a couple of standard deviations on a PRO relative to the percentage of patients getting spinal fusion or knee replacements or something like that. It just doesn't factor into their lives as much. On the provider side, I think there are some clinicians, maybe more on the research side, who are very interested in PROs, but I have to say most clinicians, even specialists, are not administering PROs routinely and then using it care. Now you might ask, should they? Could they? I think an excellent clinician doesn't need one. I think the problem is that a mediocre one would be made better by this measurement-based care, but not every mediocre clinician wants to admit they're a mediocre clinician, and I've already dug myself a hole here. But yeah, one of the
Mediocre
things
physicians don't exist. Come on, right?
no, everyone's great. But when I worked in Parkinson's disease, a patient might come to our centre in London and see one of 5 different specialists. And if you met the doctor who was interested in sleep, you can guarantee he'd ask you about sleep. But if sleep wasn't your problem, and actually it was hallucinations, and you didn't happen to manage to see the doctor who was interested in hallucinations, maybe you didn't get asked about that, right? So a PRO can be helpful in putting the control in the patient and the family's shoes a little bit, in kind of, first of all, making sure they understood what aspects of a disease could be caused by that condition, right? So maybe not everybody knew that hallucinations or constipation could be Parkinson's disease until they completed a PRO, but also that, yeah, you then just have some consistency. So yeah, some providers use them, but you mentioned the PHQ-9. In mental health, it can be a little bit more widespread than in other areas. Yeah. And then finally, the patients. In some ways, patients almost have more access nowadays to measurement through digital apps, through digital therapeutics. So in some cases, those will be a validated questionnaire like the PHQ-9 or the GAD-7. But in many cases, from a user experience point of view, from a product design point of view, those tools are not satisfying to use, particularly on a mobile phone screen. So when I started working at PatientsLikeMe, most users were on a desktop or a laptop. They had a big screen. You could ask them to click through 10 questions on a screen at one time and hit submit, and that would be fine. In the mobile form factor, that doesn't really work. And so instead we see people using sort of sliding 0 to 10 scales or kind of happy face emojis or an open text box. And although that might be a better user experience, it's not really scientifically valid. Like, I can't do math on an emoji. If you've moved from sad Lego to angry Lego, I can't submit that to the FDA.
What do you think about a swipe right, swipe left for a mobile phone? Do we think that mechanism has any legs?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, we actually developed a modular PRO system at PatientsLikeMe called Thrive, and it was designed to be for any chronic condition. And we did a few things that were radical. One is we made it positively framed. Okay. So most of these instruments we're talking about, they ask how much does it suck to be you? How terrible is it? A downer, right? So we would say, how well can you walk? And it went from not at all to a little well to somewhat well to extremely well, because probably
Okay.
some
Yeah.
people can run a marathon, but they just happen to have a chronic condition, right? So we did that for a lot of things. How are you sleeping? How terrible is your sleep? And there's a risk with some of that you actually cause some harm by making people obsess or depressed at how bad things are going. So we thought it was important to frame
I
it
think you
positively.
mentioned a nocebo effect, right?
Placebo.
By bringing attention to this, you're actually creating more of the situation than more of
Yeah.
the symptom, right?
Like, how itchy do you feel right now, Alex? How itchy do you feel now?
Paul,
Like,
thanks for that,
scratchy,
man.
like
I
things
really
in your hair. How
appreciate.
itchy would you feel? So,
Yeah,
to
exactly.
some extent, there's a possibility we are doing the same thing. And I think some clinicians have a fear that when we go to someone and say, how's your gnawing pain? How's your shooting pain? How's your stabbing pain? That we might be causing some iatrogenic harm, some sort of nocebo effect. So I think it's important to be
Yeah.
careful with that, sure. But I think what we don't want to do, though, is we don't want to ignore the patient experience. And we did some work validating some of
Right.
these scales in conditions like MS of the doctor rating versus the patient rating. And what we found was there was very good agreement on things like walking. I think whether or not you've been to med school or not, we can all agree whether or not a patient can walk down a corridor. But there was
Probably
not
good
good
measure.
agreement about fatigue, about sexual dysfunction, right? Which might be an awkward conversation to have. And so that's where we saw that disconnect. So that's where I think PROs really with the internal things that matter to you day to day, they can
Yeah.
be so important for the patient. And you can imagine if that impact is ignored and we focus on the wrong thing,
Yep.
then you're not going to have a satisfying care experience.
So, pharma companies, I'm sliding in my head, main actors, payers, not so much, providers, yes, maybe, but I'm sure as we'll get to, right, there are a bunch of like issues there, right? Whether they believe in it at all, but also like getting this data in front of them in a way that is consumable to them, like in their EHR or inside of the SOAP notes for this patient in front of them so that they can consume it all in a like quick way. And then patient side, there are a lot of things that they are kind of like the main contributors to it. And there are probably good reasons for them to do it, but life is also busy.
Yeah. So from the patient perspective, I mean, two things that I think symptom tracking would be really helpful with. One is helping the patient to realize relationships between symptoms and other aspects of their lives. So symptom tracking for a period of time can be really helpful to try and associate relationships with things like sleep, with menstrual cycle, with alcohol intake, with medication. Trends that we often hear at Patients Like Me and other places are things like, oh, my anxiety is really high on a Sunday. And sharing that with others or doing some research on that finds out there's a thing called the Sunday scaries. For example, people's return to work on Monday or school on Monday. So that can be helpful for sure. And then the other thing can be just helping to give you some for you to realize that like, oh wow, my pain was a 9 out of 10 and I've done this physio and it's been hard, but now it's a 5 out of 10. So it hasn't gone away altogether, but I can see for myself the impact because our memories are very poor for understanding symptoms and the impact of that. So it's just useful sometimes to journal, to document, and particularly if you're changing providers all the time, you owning some continuity of your experience of care or of your disease could be really powerful and quite empowering for you as an actor in the health system.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we have established pretty well why a listener who is listening to this episode may have been told or asked, voluntold by their executive team, we think we should build this, right? We think it's important to us. We think pharma companies may want some of this data. And yet, tenor of this podcast is here are the things that we learned trying to build this before that you should deeply consider before you start committing yourself to this route. One first place that I would like to start is if you want to know why things don't work, start looking where the money flows, especially in the US healthcare system. Can you give me like rough back of the envelope modeling and flow of money? Like, does this company who is building this product to gather patient reported outcomes, do they get money from pharma companies? What's the situation here?
So in terms of the financial flow, so there's a few things to be aware of. So in general, there are not millions and billions of dollars being made off the basis of moving from a 5 to a 7 on a scale. The people that develop the scales often charge a fee for the use of that question, a questionnaire called the patient activation measure, for example, which I think is a really interesting scale, but its uptake has been limited by the fact you've got to pay a couple of dollars every time you administer it. And it would always strike me that these massive pharmaceutical companies or very well-funded payer provider systems would balk at paying $2 to benchmark if a patient cared at all about looking after themselves. Because if you improve that, there was really good evidence that you could reduce their 12-month admissions. But which I'm sure cost 20 grand a pop or something. But no one wanted to pay the $2. So measurement having a cost is a problem. Imagine every time you got on your weighing scale and you set it to metric, you had to pay $1 to the Salk Institute that developed and formalized the metric system.
Yeah, that holds the kilogram.
Right, absolutely. So the PHQ-9 is in widespread use because after it was validated, it was released to the general public with no fee. So that's where one of the money flows goes. And not many people are getting rich off it, but a lot of the academics who did it, this is their holiday cottage money, their money, but and often the universities have got IP. So the universities are like, well, we've got to make some money somehow.
The 4 folks that we mentioned up above, there's actually a 5th group. And the thing that somebody building in this space should have on their radar is, at some point, if you are trying to build this out, you will probably have to pay some money to this, to the owner of the scale that you want to use, or you may consider rolling your own, which is its own complexity.
I have had more than one conversation as an advisor to startups where I've gone, hey, if you're using that questionnaire, you need permission from the university that made it, right?
And they're like,
no. Found it on the internet. They published it. That means it's free. And I have to sit them down and go, look, we need to negotiate for a license, or you're going to need to make your own measurement system, or we're going to need to work something out, because in some cases there's a famous medication adherence scale where the people that own the copyright are incredibly litigious. And there have been hundreds of lawsuits from millions for people not getting the right permission. Or let's say you publish a paper, you have to retract the paper. So that's a pretty big pitfall of, you need it in writing that you have permission from the correct license holder to use any validated questionnaire. That's a pretty key pitfall that people want to avoid.
Yeah. And you, potential listener, while you're listening to this, will probably run into a part where you learn about this, hopefully now, before you have sunk too much time into this, and you're going to have to go to somebody to say, hey, we actually need to pay $2 per user per month or something. They're going to be like, do we really? And there's kind of like a penny wise, pound foolish thing here that you want to bring to whoever you need for budget approval for this, and say, hey, we should probably just pay this one.
Yeah, and the good news is there's a big database called ProQualid, PROQOLID, pretty much has the names and addresses of everyone who owns this stuff. So that's one flow. Another area you asked about in terms of financial flows was what changes here. So for example, in the NHS, there is a mental health support system called IAPT, which gives people a PHQ-9 at intake, and then gives them CBT, and then gives them PHQ-9s along the way. One of the sort of pitfalls/financial flows is that some actors in the system might be incentivized to discharge a patient who's made a recovery before a full course of treatment has finished, because what if they come back and they get worse again, right? If you want average statistics to say people come in as a 9 out of 10, and when they leave my clinic, they're a 3 out of 10. What does that do to your incentives then? So that might change who you take on as a risky, quote, risky patient.
Totally. Cherry picking, cream skimming. Right. Yep.
Because if they're not sick enough, if they're a 2 out of 10, well, I'm not going to move them to a 1 out of 10. So maybe I just shouldn't take them on in the first place. So yeah, that's another pitfall that you can find. One thing that we see right across the board is there's really only a subset of the general population that want to track as obsessively as your statistician wants the data to analyze, right? And it could be as low as 5 to 10% of people in a good day, right? So you then have to go, okay, but what else is interesting about those people? So on Patients Like Me, for example, you'll be unsurprised to hear that patients with obsessive compulsive disorder were a lot more adherent to tracking at the cadence that you asked them to, right? Whereas there are many conditions where fatigue, tiredness, cognitive dysfunction, confusion was going to make it really difficult. So sometimes I'll be approached by companies and they'll say, look, we want to build this app with lots of questionnaires for people with mild cognitive impairment or Alzheimer's disease. And my concern is that they might not remember their email address and password and how to do a 2-factor authentication to even start the program, let alone sit there paying attention and having executive dysfunction and not being distracted for the 5 or 10 minutes what it takes to fill out the questionnaire. So you need to kind of understand.
And over however much time, weeks or months to get enough data.
Yeah, absolutely. So you need to understand, what are you going to do with missing data? If someone doesn't show up again, do you assume they got better? Do you assume they got worse? What do we do there? And yeah, to understand if the user's getting something from it. Because if they're not getting anything from completing it, they won't complete it.
This episode is about measuring patients accurately. Here's a related problem: getting paid accurately for how sick your patients actually are. We're running a free course with Rapid Inc., all about what's shifting in risk adjustment right now. V28 changes, what AI is doing to the space, and the wave of multi-million-dollar settlements you've probably been seeing in the news. The course runs April 7th through 9th, noon to 1:30 Eastern each day. If you touch risk adjustment, coding, or revenue cycle, you should be there. The chat alone is worth it. Link is in the show notes. One more thing. We're running a hardware hackathon April 17th through 19th in San Francisco, and we're looking for sponsors. We've got 70 hackers locked in from places like NVIDIA, Apple, and Google. We're putting smartwatches, continuous glucose monitors, rings, AR glasses, and audio pins in their hands for a weekend and just seeing what they build. A Tamagotchi powered by your A1C, blood pressure leaderboards, predicting falls for elderly patients. The sky is limitless. The hacker makeup is 50% engineers, 10% clinicians, with founders, product, and ops making up the rest. And, as I like to say, 100% reason to remember the name. Email nick@outofpocket.health to talk about sponsoring. So one thing that I always want to talk about is, for now, I'm calling it failure modes, right? Like kind of like paths that we went down, and we're like, actually, we got to back this out and go a different path. So one of the things that you and I talked about, I think, is like, based on the condition that you are trying to get patient-reported outcomes on, it's going to be really hard to get patients to report their symptoms, right? Like, as you were saying, executive dysfunction, they just may not be able to sit down and fill out the survey. Doesn't matter how easy you make it, doesn't matter how much UX design and UI that you put into it, they might not even remember to open up the app. So that's one. Then there's something around like, there's personality quirks maybe, or I'm thinking of like, what is it, like conscientiousness to chaos. There's just a personality thing of like, to your point, maybe like obsessive compulsive or hypochondriac, right? Like your user who is still within some like bounds of condition may just be like, oh, there's so much more detail that I need here, versus somebody else who's like, it was like maybe like a 4 or a 5, and that's just their response. So how are you, now I'm speaking to the listener, right, like person who is building this, how are you going to rationalize and normalize between these two very different human beings, but who still fall into the condition that you have in mind?
Yeah, because often the way the questionnaires are designed is they're often designed for clinical trials to see if a drug has had an effect. So if you're then asking people to fill it out every week to make a graph on an app, that's not what they were built for. So I had one sort of false start in a community I built for psoriasis, for example, where we tried to adapt a questionnaire that was about itch and scaling and rashes and where it is on your body and that type of stuff. But one of the challenges was that people just wanted to take a photo and let nature work it out, right? Like,
sure, yeah,
taking a palm of their hand and mapping it to each part of their body because that's 1% of your surface area. They were like, well, here's a photo. So then we had to deal with the fact that people were uploading photos of themselves with no clothes on. So that was something we had to deal with. And then one of my marketing colleagues developed a questionnaire about things that were more relevant to people's lives. And she sent out a big survey just through email with a single question that you could click. And it was about, what do you think of sun cream in July when we sent this August? Does it make you happy as a clam or crabby as a crab? And that question got way more engagement than my scientific scale. And so we kind of realized that actually maybe the answer is a mix, right? Maybe there's an answer of talk to people, like good people, but also go, hey, here comes the science, but give something in terms of feedback as to why. So what we would then evolve to do is, so for one thing, giving people feedback on what this means for them, giving people like, hey, these things got worse, these things got better, tying together things they can do. Like, hey, did you know there's this intervention that you can take for itchiness? But also to perhaps be realistic about for how long we want people to engage in self-tracking. Because if I say to you, I want you to fill out this questionnaire once a month for the rest of my life, really? Like, it's a hard job to get
right. What am I signing up for? What am I?
Right. And so it has to close some sort of loop. It has to be valuable. And then you just have to look at, people don't do their New Year's resolutions. They don't finish the books they buy. They don't finish the Netflix series. And those things are things they wanted to do. So you should expect that degree of drop off over time. And so, it's just kind of understanding what incentives do people react to. Another pitfall I've seen people fall into is to say, well, we'll give you $10 if you complete this questionnaire. So you should then expect to have about 5 million signups from bots in Southeast Asia, where in the open text box, they're replying, A+ would use this pizza or delivery service again. And now you've got to figure out all your data. So it's probably not that.
Yeah, now you have to take a task to clean up your data.
And many survey researchers are reporting 80 to 90% plus of survey data with financial incentives being fraudulent. So that's really important. And that's even with checks on IP and putting in nonsense questions and that type of thing. So what I've seen work well in the past is when you're engaging with people, kind of setting a group. If 500 people complete this questionnaire twice in 3 months, it'll allow us to do this research. So we'll make a donation to this nonprofit that we're partnered with. And when we analyze the data, we're going to give you back an infographic with a high-level summary, and we're going to do a video interview, like an AMA, with the research scientist who's done it. And then people can ask their questions. And then if they feel like they're in this give something, get something loop, then they go, oh, that's where my data is going. Because for the vast majority of experiences in healthcare, all your data just goes in the black hole.
Gets sucked up. Not just healthcare, right? Social media.
Everywhere.
Yeah.
And so I think people don't want to be tracked, but they will share their experiences, but only if that's going to be put to good use. And I think one of the frustrations that people have if they're diagnosed with cancer or their child has some condition is they go to the doctor and they tell them all this stuff. I'm pretty sure they think that all that experience is going to some supercomputer somewhere.
Yeah.
And it's going to Harvard and Stanford and Oxford. And that then Pfizer and AstraZeneca and Biogen are all sitting around and they're pulling out this data and it's all connected like some sort of giant Minority Report screen.
That's what I was thinking, Minority Report.
And the truth is,
and
it's not written down in the first place at all. What is written down is written down for billing. It's not shared. It's not used for research. It's not going to our universities. One doctor at Oxford can't see the data that another doctor at Oxford has collected.
Yeah.
They're only interested in their super duper little niche interest, their little hobby of figuring out why people are left-handed or something, and not cracking the problems that really matter to patients. So to some extent, the reason I think this stuff is so important is we do have an opportunity to build differently. But, as we've said, I think the incentives are not currently aligned in those ways. And so it's been interesting seeing people like the long COVID community come together and try and solve their own problems with symptom tracking and intervention tracking, because the system isn't built for that. And so it's a shame, really, because we could have done a lot. I mean, rehabilitated my own breathing function after I got COVID-19, and it's a shame that my experience hasn't gone somewhere so that someone else can you figure out the little respiratory muscle trainer that I used or something like that. So it's frustrating that we haven't been able to build the system that we all deserve.
Oh man. One question. Your colleague, has she licensed the crab-to-clam scale so that I can use it for a future study of mine? How much do I have to pay her to use it?
My good friend in Boston, I think a lobster roll should do it.
A lobster roll, okay. Yeah. But now is a lobster roll somewhere on that spectrum when we're talking sea animals and crustaceans?
There's a food truck just by the Children's Science Museum in Boston. I think one of those bad boys will probably set you back $25. You'd probably wish you'd paid the cash.
Yeah. Okay. So some of the things that I'm pulling away from here, like some of the questions that you, listener, are going to have to answer, right? Do you want to pay the owners of the scale developers for your given condition or conditions some amount, or do you want to invent your own, which has its own, we didn't even get to that, right? But just maybe listen to part 2, right, of this for how to do that. How often are you going to ask users to complete the surveys, and have you done your work in making sure that what you are asking them to complete fits into their lives and conditions that you are asking them to track? How are you going to manage, or what is your opinion and kind of like product stance on folks being a spectrum of like conscientiousness or into the various gradations of their condition, right? Like there are some folks who are like, yesterday or this afternoon, I was a 10 and now I'm a 9. And this afternoon later, I'm going to be back to a 10. And that's where somebody else is going to be like, last week I was a 5-ish. And this week I'm maybe like a 10. So there are different swings, different time periods. And then we didn't even get into ontology, right? Like you mentioned, is it puking versus vomit versus nausea? Like there's a whole set of kind of like vocabulary that you're going to have to try and figure out.
The good news is you can go to your patients, you can do user research, you can ask them what comes up in their own language, but there's definitely aspects of ontology. And then just in case you weren't nervous enough, if you start overlaying interpretations of these scores, so instead of just saying you're a 5, but to say, oh, you're a 5, that's severe, that starts bringing you up the regulatory scale of being a medical device. So, it's all very useful stuff. And I think symptom tracking can be engaging for a subset of people. But just be aware that the more sophisticated a tool you build, the more responsibilities you inherit.
Yeah, there's an upper bound that you have to be very careful here, where you cannot translate the data that you get into a medical opinion. Otherwise, you product manager or designer or engineer, you got a different set of problems on your hands and you've just bumbled into it. So don't like know that exists, and you may end up bumping against it. There's a separate thing that you mentioned about pharmacovigilance. I'm just going to put a yellow flag in there for now because we are not going to have time to discuss it. Paul, I had some lightning round questions, but we don't have time. I will ask you though, anything to plug?
Yes, anything to plug? Well, my favorite type of thing to work on is people generating evidence to prove that their digital health intervention is useful for people. I would love to work with anyone that's interested in that. You can find me, Paul Wicks, on LinkedIn, and we'll figure it out from there.
Yeah, and we'll put links in show notes.
Perfect. Thank you.